Hello, good morning. He says, good morning. When I was at Walsh and the rabbi said good morning, they all said, good morning, Rabbi. But that must be a Catholic response. I don't know. So it's lovely to have this fourth session for us together. I'm glad that you've come back. It shows that I haven't messed up terribly. And we have one more session after this, which we'll talk about in a moment. Though a lot of material to cover today, I really did too much. So I'm going to try to get us moving here. And the best way to do that is to get us moving here. This is session 4. New. See, it's supposed to, after session 4, say, Learning with Rabbi Larry Hoffman. So just imagine that. And it's also, oh, there it was. Oh, my goodness. Oh. All right, we're going to do this again. All right, so we're going to do this. Try again. There we go. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So, as we did before, this is what I call shameless self-promotion. You have an opportunity to see what's coming up. Today we're going to do some learning with Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman, one of my teachers that I never studied in person with. And actually I did once. And his special contribution for today's conversation is the My People's series. You'll hear him talk in a little while. He did My People's Prayer Book. He did My People's Haggadah. And it's an instructive end of the development of literature we're going to talk about today. Next week, we're going to try to bring all of this stuff together. Now, what is the religious enterprise that is based on text? What is it all about? And we'll talk about whether it's Judaism and the Hebrew Bible and the literature that comes from that, or the New Testament material. What is it for? And you sort of get that in the title from Rabbi Norman Cohen, Self-Struggle and Change, Family Conflicts, Stories in Genesis or in our sacred literature, and their healing insights for our times, for our lives. And really, isn't that what we read Scripture for? So that we can become whole, so that we can be more effective in working in the world, so that we can do God's work and move towards God's sense of fulfillment for the plan. Okay, we're going to do a quick review. Over the years that I've been here, I've done a couple of these things, and I'm just going to take you through the development of Jewish literature, and you'll see that why it's important. So we first start by talking about how the Hebrew texts of Jewish life were canonized at different periods. The Torah, or the first 5 books, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim, which of course are from the Greek translations, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they were probably canonized, made sacred texts by the time of the destruction of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, sometime around during the time of 586 before the Common Era. And I think we've talked before, we use before the Common Era as opposed to Christian era because we don't want to make these dates religious. They are just a way of telling how culturally we tell time. The next books were called the Nevi'im, the prophets, and they were probably done sometime close to the Persian period, 323 before the Common Era, getting right into the area of Alexander the Great and the rise of Hellenistic and then, or Hellenic and then Hellenistic and Greek culture. So you can imagine that as we go through the Hebrew Bible, we're going to start to see a difference in some ideas that were pre-586, that might have been 7th century, 8th century, 9th century before the Common Era, and those ideas that now come into the world through Greek philosophy and so on and so forth. And finally, the Ketuvim, the writings, were probably finished by the 2nd century, which is around the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Second Temple, Herod's temple, Jesus' temple, in the 2nd century. And so these writings sometimes are going to have some kind of influence, for example, from the Roman world. And those three different sets of literature, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, form what we call Tanakh, which is Hebrew Bible, normally counted as 24 books, in the year 70 of the Common Era. And with the destruction of the temple is the destruction and displacement of the priesthood, which means the sacrificial cult, sacrificing animals as gifts to God. Smoke goes up and is of sweet savor to the creator of the universe. They are no longer are able to offer those sacrifices, because while many sacrifices could be offered in many high places in the Promised Land, those of you who have been to Israel with Nancy and with me or with Rabbi Komarovsky will have seen a number of those bamot, those high places, very often where pagan sacrifices were offered, but there were also Jewish altars, and you could bring offerings of thanksgiving and so on to those. But 3 times a year, the Torah tells us, you had to go to Jerusalem in order to make your offering at the temple in Jerusalem. So now that that's gone, we have a real problem, real power vacuum. Not only can we not offer sacrifices there, but because the Romans have destroyed the Promised Land, have destroyed Judea, all these other cultures that live there, pagan cultures that live there, began to put down roots and began to grow. One of those cultures, which was not a pagan culture, thank you very much for the cookies, appreciate it, that was not a pagan culture, was this nascent Christianity. Okay, if we date Jesus in the first third of the 1st century, by the year 70, you've got a group of disciples and apostles, and you know your history. What am I telling you history for? That became pretty important to find a way to take the oral tradition, the tradition that was not written down but handed down orally, and A, remember it, and B, adapt it to what for them was modern times, their current situation. There's a wonderful story, Josephus helps us remember it, about a man by the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. All the good rabbis are named Yochanan. Except I'm ben Matityahu. My father sold ladies' clothing. So Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Pharisee in Jerusalem while Jerusalem was under siege. And he was trying to create peace amidst the strife amongst the different segments of the Jews that were in Jerusalem while the Romans were besieging the city. The general that was in charge of the Roman legion, who would ultimately destroy Jerusalem's name was Vespasian. You probably know the name Vespasian. Sure, you do. It's very common. Many people name their grandchildren Vespasian. So Ben Zakkai had his students smuggle him out of Jerusalem through the Roman lines. They put him in a casket. They weighed the casket down with stones, and they carried him through the Roman lines. And Ben Zakkai went in front of General Vespasian and made some predictions. He predicted the destruction of the temple, which came very closely after he left. He predicted also that Vespasian would become the emperor of Rome. And Vespasian said in his good Latin, "What?" Well, as you know, Vespasian did become a Roman emperor, and to show his gratitude to Ben Zakkai for these predictions that came true, he allowed Ben Zakkai 3 wishes. The first wish that Ben Zakkai asked for was the ability to create an academy, a school, in this community called Yavne, which is by the Mediterranean Sea. And Christian Bibles usually translate it as the Jamnia. The second thing was to guarantee the history, the survival of the sages that lived in Yavne, which is very important because they were descendants of Tzadok, of the Davidic line from the temple. Why is that important? Who is the Messiah supposed to come from? The line of David. And if all the Tzadokites, Sadducees, if all the Tzadokites were murdered, the line of David would end, and the Messiah would not come. So he wanted to make sure that these people who were the descendants of Tzadok were spared, and they were. And thirdly, he wanted a physician to come to treat one of the ancient rabbis who for 40 years fasted in order to keep Jerusalem safe. How could someone fast for 40 years? Remember a fast? It's like with the Muslims, is sun up to sundown. So this rabbi fasted all that period of time. Because of that, Ben Zakkai is now able to take the oral tradition that he knew, because it was passed on orally, all these people studied and learned it, and he could teach it to his disciples. And when his disciples were masters of that tradition, he would give them smicha. He would ordain them. Smicha means to lay on the hands, in the same way that Moses placed his hands on Joshua. That process of smicha, of laying on the hands, ordained them as rabbis. So what was before simply an honorific, in the same way we might say sir, if I bumped into you and said, "Excuse me, sir." In England, there comes a time when sir, the honorific, becomes a title. He's a knight. Okay? So with Ben Zakkai and Yavne, we have the beginning of what we normally would call the rabbinic period. And why are the rabbis important? The rabbis are important because they were able to craft the beginning of the transition from a temple organized Judaism to a non-temple Judaism. One of the things that Ben Zakkai taught, I never remember these references, so I wrote it down. From Hosea 6, it says, "For I cherish steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." And on verses like that, Ben Zakkai was able to create the sense that it wasn't slaughtering of animals that was important. You could manifest your love of God in other ways. Another prophet says, I want the bullocks of your lips. Well, that's beautiful. Bullocks were sacrificed, but if the bullocks of your lips, what are they? Those are words. So the rabbis are very, very important because they make the difference between a Judaism that is located on the rubble of the temple and a Judaism that still can be alive. In essence, we are still in the rabbinic period. As time goes on, the Sanhedrin, which is now reconstituted and meeting in Yavne, begins to go through the oral tradition, because there are many different texts that are remembered. And there is a need, just as they had canonized the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, there is a need to decide which sayings of which rabbis are authoritative. And so, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the prince, Judah the president, who was the president of the Sanhedrin, and his disciples began going through the oral tradition and writing it down. We'll still call it the oral tradition, but it's going to be written down. And towards the end of the 3rd century, right around 200, the beginning of the 3rd century, right around 200, that oral tradition is written down in a book called the Mishnah. Come on. Now, as Jews do, once you write the Mishnaic text down, people begin to study it. And as they study it, there are individuals who write commentaries on it. And when you take the commentaries that begin being written around 200 of the Common Era through about 500 of the Common Era, which is called the Gemara, the conclusion or completion, and you put them together, you have what we know today as the Talmud. The first printed edition, full printed edition, was printed by Daniel Bomberg. He was a non-Jew. He was the first non-Jew to print Hebrew books. And you see when he lives in the latter part of the 15th and the early part of the 16th century, and he printed a whole bunch of different books. He had his press in Venice most of the time, although it did move around. And he wrote something called he printed something called Mikrot Gedolot, which I'll show you in a few moments, which is the Rabbi's Bible or the Great Bible. He also wrote complete sets of the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud. You know that after the destruction of the first temple, a whole group of Jews was exiled to Babylonia. By the waters of Babylon we sat and wept when they asked us to sing songs of Zion. Not all of the Jews in Babylonia returned when we were allowed to return. So you had an ancient Jewish community in Babylonia which had been wealthy and had been pretty open to Jewish settlement there, which meant that the great academies, the great teachers, were able to live and produce materials in Babylonia. You also then had, after the community of the return, you had a smaller, less affluent Jewish community that went back to Jerusalem and Judea. They also made commentaries on the Talmud. So we have two different Talmuds, a Jerusalem Talmud, which is smaller, and a Babylonian Talmud, which is much, much larger. Takes about 14 volumes to have the whole Babylonian Talmud. Babylonian Talmud is composed of dapim, pages, but a Talmudic page is actually a daf, a page that has two sides. To give you an idea of the extent of that material, there is a common practice, study practice today called daf yomi, reading a daf, two sides of a page, every day, from start to finish, which takes about 7.5 years. It's quite an extraordinary book. The thing that the Bomberg also did is that he followed the layout you see by the Sanchino family. You probably have heard of the Sanchino Press, I hope. It's a new press named after this printing family, Jewish family, who wrote a copy of the Talmud, and they wrote it in a very particular way. Come on, Daniel. Here is an early copy, one of the earliest pages of a printed Talmud. First of all, it's got a little bit of art to it. Do you see the slide? You do? I can't. So I can't use it. It's got the big letters up there say, Mi Matai, from what time? This is the beginning of Tractate Barachot, the tractate about blessings. It is the first Mishnah in the tractate about blessings. And then you'll notice that after you read through some of this text, it comes. This was really much shorter before. I don't think it started until back then. You'll see over here, maybe it will work if I go closer. Oh man, Spitzer's having trouble today. Huh? This is a test. This is why they stop you after 50 years, because you can't do a damn thing after it. There you go. There we go. I can't see. There it is. So perhaps you see this right here. So here is the beginning of the Talmudic text, and then you have this is the Mishnah, and then you have the rabbinic commentary that is the Gemara, and together that's a page of Talmud. Now, watch how it develops. You notice here's another page of Talmud. You can tell, I think already, that this is the Mishnah, and this is the Gemara, but look how now the structure of the commentaries round about it. What you're seeing is the development of a Talmudic architecture. This is a page of Talmud today. Happens to be the Sanchino layout, the Sanchino edition. Again, here is the beginning of the Mishnah, and then I can't see where it would be here. There should be two larger letters, a Gimel and a Mem, which begin the Gemara. So this is the actual Talmudic text. But now we've got commentaries here, and here, and we've got different apparatuses, apparati, whatever that is, on the sides here. Some of these apparatuses, apparati, will send us to different tractates of Talmud that happen to talk about the same subject. Because remember, Talmud originally was an oral document, which means that as I'm talking about flowers, you will say, oh, roses. I had this beautiful painting of roses over here. It was done by so-and-so, and they worked very hard on it, and somebody will say, come on, let's talk back about roses like flowers, and then we move back to the text. So sometimes it helps us to understand what's going on. The arguments become clearer if we can gather together other parts of the Talmud that speak on the topic. Some of them also, of these apparatuses, whatever the word is, uh, will help us by pointing us to codes of Jewish law. Later on in the Middle Ages, people didn't have time to go through the whole argument in the Talmudic text, so they only pulled out the settled law, and they created codes of Jewish law. Well, if you knew where the text was going, sometimes that helps you figure out the route. So you have all of these different kinds of commentaries around the page of Talmud. Now, just for those of you who might be like really silly and want to really study this stuff, I would recommend two things. This book is called Back to the Sources, Reading the Classic Jewish Texts, and it's edited by Barry Holtz. And the various chapter authors in the book tell you how to study Hebrew Bible, how to study these commentaries, how to study the Talmud, how to study, and give you wonderful examples. And I think it's pretty accessible. So if you're interested, you might want to take a look at this. I think I've got a page coming up that you're going to see of this. The other book, which I don't know that you want to buy, but you will be able to use it in the Temple Israel Library, there is a new edition of Talmud called the Steinsaltz edition. It is a beautiful book. It's got nice gold coloring on the end pages. It feels good in your hand. This first volume is called the Reference Guide, and this one has the history, the names of the rabbis, the shorthand that is used for writing the Talmud, the catchphrases that tell you what kind of an argument it is, and so on. I'm going to pass this around because it really is gorgeous. It really is very, very pretty. So you may be interested in taking a look at this just for fun. Show and tell. So that's the first volume of the Steinsaltz edition. And as I say, it's in the Temple Israel Library. If you ever really want to, spend a couple hours just seeing what a Talmudic page looks like and sounds like, please feel free to come and do that. So, note the architecture of the page. So what are you seeing there when you see those pages set up in that way? Well, one of the things that you see is that the text is timeless. You sit down with a book in 2023 and you are looking at something, the earliest quotations probably go back to the 1st century before the Common Era. So it's like over 2,100 years old. And you see commentators on it who are, in essence, talking to each other. And when you put it on the table, on your desk, and you sit in front of it, you are part of the conversation. So from that, you see that the architecture creates a dialogue. Jewish study is dialogic. You can buy each of these various commentaries and such in their own book, which is very, very nice. But they're not as rich as they are when they're all on the same page, because as you read them and as you study them, it raises new ideas, new questions, and so on and so forth. And you bring yourself to the page. And that's pretty nifty, I think. So that becomes, that structured page, that architecture becomes kind of characteristic of Jewish literature. And you're going to see that especially when we come to look at Hoffman's My People's Prayer Book. I'm going to give you a quick look at Mikrot Gedolot, the Rabbi's Bible. The Rabbi's Bible is a biblical commentary, and it has the same kind of architecture. Here is a new edition of Mikrot Gedolot. This is just the book of Exodus. But you will be able to see, I hope even from where you're sitting, that there is a central column, which is the biblical text in Hebrew. And then around it you will see something called the Targum, the translation. Normally the Targum is Targum Onkelos, which is an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text. Why would we have an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text? Anybody? Because Aramaic was the language of the day. It was the everyday language that people spoke, and not everybody could parse the Hebrew. So they needed just as many English speakers. They need an English translation of the Greek texts of the New Testament, because we don't read Greek anymore. And then it has several important commentators that comment on the text. This is another beautiful book. Beautiful books normally mean they cost a lot of money. So in that edition of Mikrot Gedolot, in addition to the Hebrew text and the Targum Onkelos, you have focusing on 4 different commentators that one. Rashi, Rabbi Shimon Yitzchaki, who was wrote in southern France, and he's 11th century a writer. Rashi is the most important, the foundational commentator on Hebrew Bible and on Talmud. As a matter of fact, when you open a page of Talmud, Rashi is always on the split, always on the inside split, which is an honored place, I guess. Then you have Rashbam, which is Rabbi Shimon ben Meir. He is late 11th century into the 12th century. He's from northern France. And then you have the commentator Ibn Ezra. It says 1989. He's not that old. It should be a 0, have fat fingers. 1089 through 1164 into the 12th century. And then you have Rashban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, or Nachmanides, and he is basically 13th century Spain, northern Spain. So you have here commentators who are, in a sense, talking to each other about this same text. They have different points of view and interests. They come from different times and different locations. One of them comes from, or 2 of them come from Islamic Spain. There is a difference between northern France and southern France in traditions and so on. So this dialogic text becomes pretty significant. What I did, I hope it's all right. Hope it will. I've made some copies here. Just a random section. Maybe you can take 2. Thank you. Thank you. There should be 20 of them there, so a couple each table. This happens to be the section that is making comments in the book of Exodus on the verse, "And God hardened Pharaoh's heart." So you can take a look at the page. The first page with the Hebrew text on it is the page that is in this Mikrot Gedolot that's being passed around. And then behind it behind it are a couple pages from Back to the Sources. And what's happened in Back to the Sources is that the author of this particular section is putting it sort of in the colloquial English what the text is doing, what these commentators roundabout are talking about. So you'll see, and this is on, the page number says 256. Okay. So halfway down the page, the text is talking about Joseph wandering in the field. You know the story? Jacob sends his son Joseph to find his brothers who hate him because they are shepherding the sheep in Dothan, which everybody thinks is really in Shechem, and not in Shechem. And when he's walking around in the field aimlessly, he encounters a man. And the rabbis are interested in that term, a man. Why does it say a man? So he goes on. Rashi says he is the angel Gabriel. Ibn Ezra says, what? Where'd you get that from? Rashi says, from the Midrash Tanchuma, this is the tradition that our sages have handed down to us. Ibn Ezra responds, wait a second. Where does the text say anything about angels? Rashi says, you see, the verse says, a man found him. And as everyone knows, in the book of Daniel, Gabriel is referred to as the man. Same word. Ibn Ezra says, you go to the book of Daniel to explain this verse in Genesis? The Pshita, or the Pshat, the simple meaning of the text. The simple meaning of the text, he says, is clearly, he was just an ordinary wayfarer, just what the text says, a man. And then Rashbam, comes into the discussion. I'm afraid you gentlemen are getting bogged down in the wrong, or at least a trivial question. The interesting angle is, why does the text divert us from Joseph's inevitable confrontation with his brothers by introducing this episode about the man giving directions? At which point you and I, who are reading the text, say, we were wondering the same thing. It creates suspense, doesn't it? Rashbam says, you moderns are too obsessed with technique. The episode teaches us of the magnitude of Joseph's filial relationship. Don't you think Joseph knew his brothers hated him? Yeah, he did. And we said, well, so Rashbam continues. Of course he knew. Yet, even after Joseph failed to find his brothers in Shechem, he made use of the wayfarer and asked him of his brothers' whereabouts. He persisted in fulfilling his father's request. Nachmanides now chimes in, quite right. Rashbam, I can't read either. Rashbam, Joseph had good reason to give up the search, but he went out of his way to honor his father's wish. I don't think we should go glibly abandon the idea of the angel, however. We say, you're a philosopher, and you're talking about angels? in Nachmanides a bit of this mystical understanding of the text. They are messengers of God, and so this man, this Ish, was a human being, but was a messenger of God, sending Joseph in the right direction, which for Joseph was the wrong direction, but turned out to be the right direction. But that's a whole other story. So you see how the architecture of the page interacts with these commentators over time. So now we're going to talk about who I want to talk about. Who is Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman, and what does he sound like? Now, if we're lucky, can you, somebody zap that? I don't think I can get that to work, can I, with this? I think if you take the cursor and just tap the link, that is a hyperlink. I learned that. Try it. This is a good thing.
It is an enormous pleasure and a huge privilege this morning to welcome you, Rabbi Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, to the LJS, Professor Emeritus at the New York campus of the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. From the moment I entered Leo Baeck College, a few years ago now, Rabbi Hoffman's scholarship and research was consistently commended, particularly on the subject of liturgy, ritual and worship, spirituality and theology. And as the progressive movements began to evaluate the direction that they were taking and should take, Rabbi Hoffman was again the guide on synagogue transformation and leadership. He has written and edited 45 books to date, including My People's Prayer Book, now a 10-volume edition of the Siddur with modern commentaries. There is much, much more to tell of his achievements and awards, but that would be to take up the time that I would like to give to you, Rabbi Hoffman, to speak to us this morning on the spirituality of the Torah, your life in miniature. We welcome you with the words of the psalmist, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, birachnuchem mi beit Adonai. Blessed are you who come in the name of the Eternal One. We bless you from the house of the Eternal One.
He's walking up to the podium now.
To begin with, thank you, Rabbi Wright. What a lovely introduction. I'm honored and grateful to you for it. And I must say, it is a distinct honor to be here with you. Many years ago, long before I had any notion I would ever find my way here, this synagogue was recommended to me as the great institution that it is, a destination point, if you like. We think these days of destination weddings where you come together to be at the destination, and if there is a destination synagogue, this is it. So I entered it. We had a class this morning on the sacred, and I almost thought to myself, well, I won't bother teaching it because here you are. You already know it. I am surrounded by a sense of history, a sense of the depth of Jewish tradition, a sense of the great rabbis who have and who now serve this congregation, and all it is that you represent just by being here. I'm grateful for your welcome beyond words. Thank you. We regularly have an understanding of whatever Sedra it is for that week. We meet on Shabbat to pray and to read from the Sedra and to learn what we can learn from that Sedra. But I often think to myself, to simply read the Sedra itself, which of course is what Jews do, We can lose track of the larger picture, the Torah as a whole. It would be as if you decided to read a mystery novel and every week you read 10 pages. It would be very hard to keep track of the entire story, especially since with the sermon and with the commentaries that are brought to mind by what the preacher has to say, you go deeper and deeper into the details, and you know the details of the details. But I wonder if we could pan out for just a moment and look at what the Torah as a whole is, because it is a whole. Whatever. The Torah is seen as the Torah, not simply this book or that book, but those 5 books, all the way from Genesis to Deuteronomy. What if we were to look at all of that? I think were we to do that, we would discover that the 5 books of Torah reflect not just those formative years of Israel's experience from the time of the founding of the world, as it were, with Adam and Eve, and certainly Abraham and Sarah, and all the way then to Moses and entering the Promised Land. But actually, it has within it a flow, which is the flow of a human life, any human life. And I think to myself, as we read the Torah and read the story with manifest content and the commentaries underneath it, it pays also to think of ourselves, our own lives. Where are we in Torah?
That's a good thing. Well, I didn't need that anyway. Technology is not my thing. What we're going to do now, since I wanted to share with you Hoffman's teachings, I mentioned to you that Dr. Hoffman, Rabbi Hoffman, is author of a number of different books, and we're going to look at one of them today. This is the first volume of My People's Prayer Book, which I'll show you in a moment. And this is a volume of a 2-volume series called My People's Passover Haggadah. And you'll see, I'll pass this around for you to look at. You'll see that what we have in these books is the same kind of architecture. The focus is on the actual Hebrew text, and there are commentators all around. But these are modern commentators. I'd like to get past this. Should I do this again? There you go. Cool. The Messiah has come. Thank you very, very much. It's beautiful. So this is, as you can see, the first volume of the text of My People's Prayer Books. And I picked this one because Pastor Dave asked me a question a couple weeks ago about the origin of the Shema. And so this is the first volume in My People's Prayer Book, in which he, in 12 volumes, goes through the morning service and gives commentary and so on. I wrote my name up there. I have nothing to do with writing the book. So the first thing about these books that's really neat is that he does wonderful, wonderful introductions. And at the beginning of in the beginning of My People's Prayer Book, he talks about the development of Jewish liturgy. We have the question, where did our prayer service come from? We know that biblically, worship was originally done by sacrifice. You had either an animal, large or small, or you had some vegetable product like grain or olives or whatever, and you would bring them to a Kohen or a priest who would offer them up to God. And that's how people prayed. We also know that during the early Second Temple period, after the return from Babylonia, that there was probably a, quote, prayer service that went on in another part of the temple while there were sacrifices being offered. So you had two different ways of connecting with God. Pardon me. What did that prayer service sound like? Through research and looking at different texts and so on and so forth, this is the speculation. Speculation is that the prayer service in the temple sounded like jazz. What is jazz? Jazz is basically a particular melody or a particular riff, which people then take off on and innovate with. And what makes jazz really good is if somebody's able to really masterfully take off on a particular riff and be creative and engaging and spiritual. The question then becomes, what were the basic themes upon which these innovations, this jazz, was written on? And it's felt that there were probably 2 or 3 or 4 basic rubrics of that prayer service. They probably said the 10 Commandments at that point. They probably read some section of Torah. They probably said the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And then all the other stuff was sort of jazz around those themes. Comes the destruction of the temple in the year 70, and there are a bunch of different oral traditions about what makes this service. So Jewish communities around the world at that time, small communities and little shtetls and so on and so forth, they wanted to know that they were doing it right. When you take a look at these texts move towards trying to find out what's the answer. They're dialogic in that respect. Let's go back and forth and let's figure it out. So they would send tshuvot, which means questions, and they would get responsa back, letters back answering their questions. And one of the most important responses came from Rav Amram. Thank you. Rav Amram Gaon, who was, Gaon is a title for a really smart guy. So that somebody sent him a letter, a community sent him a letter, and said, what is the proper seder for our tefillah? What is the proper order for our prayers? Because we have a number of different traditions. Rav Amram sends them back an answer. Rav Amram, this is what I think is the proper order. And Seder Rav Amram, which I think is about 9th century, I think it's 9th century, Seder Rav Amram gives an order which becomes the foundation of Jewish prayer. So what we have here in the introduction, you can see how Hoffman, that must have a light someplace over here. Don't look at it. You can see how Hoffman has diagrammed this, starting down here with Birkat HaShachar, the morning blessings. This is for a morning service. It's a whole series of morning blessings that one says to wake themselves up spiritually. It also is the reason why some people get to the synagogue early because they want to do those, and other people know they don't have to come for another half an hour. Then after that is Pesukei de Zimra, which are paragraphs of song and praise. We haven't even gotten to the service yet. And then comes Shema Uvirchoteha, the Shema and her blessings, and that's about creed. And then comes the Amidah, the standing prayer, which is all about petitions. And then comes after that silent prayer because not everything should be fixed. There are two principles to Jewish prayer, and I think they also probably apply to Presbyterian prayer. One is called keva, the fixed ritual. You know that there are certain things that have to be in the Presbyterian service to make it a service. And so you have an order of service. But there is also something called kavanah, the intent, the spirituality that you bring to it, where you hope the prayers will take you. So you can have a worship service in which you do everything by rote, and it'll be a worship service. But if you bring the proper kavanah to the service, the proper intention and the openness, it will be a worship experience. And Christ Church uses music for that all the time. Your choir inspires kavanah in the people who listen to it. And then after that, there are the concluding parts. So these books, My People's Prayer Book, My People's Haggadah, and so on, have wonderful, wonderful introductions in them that are very instructive. Okay, now. Here is one page, the Baruch Hu, the morning call to prayer. What do we have here? You have, on the right side, you have the Hebrew text of the prayers, and then you have Targum. You have the translation into English. Because while you could learn the Hebrew prayers, they're much more meaningful if you can understand what they're trying to say. So we have Targum here. And then we have a variety of commentators that Hoffman has put together. Mark Brettler gives a commentary on the biblical heritage behind these prayers. Elliot Dorff talks about the theological implications of these prayers. Susan Einbinder talks about medieval wisdom, these commentators from like Rashi and so on. What do they talk about? David Ellenson, how the modern prayer book evolved. Most organizations that have organized clergy, for example, or organized congregations, use worship literature as a way to make money. Well, our coffers are ending. Let's put out a new prayer book and make everybody buy it. She's going to talk about how the modern prayer book evolved. Joel Hoffman writes what the prayers really say. Larry Hoffman, the editor of the book, is the origins of the liturgy. Larry Kushner and Nehemiah Poland, put in for 2 weeks, is going to talk about the Hasidic mystical perspectives of the service. Daniel Landis, the halacha, the laws of prayer, and finally Judith Plasko of feminist theology. And those people are all around the text. Hebrew text in the middle, translation just underneath it, and then these other commentators around about, so that they are in dialogue with the reader, with the person who is studying. So what I thought we would do, and we don't have much time to do it, because we have to go to church. What I thought we would do at this time is to take this particular prayer, which is the call to worship, the Baruch Hu, and take that prayer and then read. Is that what I've got here? I'm 2 pages behind, so you never can tell. No, this is the Shema. Okay. To take the Shema, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one, and picked 1 or 2 of the commentators to see how their perspective enriches the text and tells you something about it. So you saw a moment ago, maybe I can go back to it. These are the commentators that are there. Somebody tell me someone that you're interested in. I'm sorry? Kushner? He's my favorite too, in case you didn't know that. She's not a plant. No, she's real flesh and blood. You got it? That's very good. So here's what Larry Kushner and Nehemiah Poland say. I need to get the actual text because it goes on to another page. I don't see the page number. Well, we'll find it. Be patient with me. That's the Baruch Hu. That's not it. Here it is. Okay. Kushner. Rabbi Kushner says, Adonai is one. That's the text that he's going to be discussing. Adonai is one. The theology of Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the great Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe of Lubavitch Hasidism, which is 18th century, early 19th century, continued on page 93. Where are you? That's because this is the other thing that drives you nuts. Known also as the Baal HaTanya, the author of the Tanya, the masterwork of Chabad Hasidim, maintains that nothing exists but God. This acosmism, isn't that an interesting term? I never really looked at that carefully. This acosmism denies the reality of the cosmos. God is not only the basis of reality, God is the only reality. God is all there is. Creation is continuously brought into being through the divine word. If our eyes could truly see reality, we would see no material world at all, but instead behold God's continuous utterance of the Hebrew letters, the real matrix of all being. Inasmuch as a radical monism, in such a radical monism, the Shema, the declaration of God's unity, means effectively that nothing exists besides God. And he gives a quote here that says, in the heavens above and on the earth below, Ein Od, there is nothing else besides God. This means that even the material earth, which appears to be, to the eye of all, to be actually existing, is not, and complete nothingness is in relationship to the Holy One, blessed be. It says he, we would say God today. And finally, he goes on. As his editor explains in the English translation, the unity of God does not mean only that there is no other God, but that there is nothing apart from God. There is no existence whatsoever apart from God's existence. The whole creation is nullified with God. Is that right? Yeah, is nullified with God as the rays of the sun within the orb of the sun. This is the meaning of Ichud Ilya, higher unity. But how do we reconcile the apparent contradiction between this acosmic theory of reality and the inescapable experience of living in an obviously material world? Anyone can have a vision of the unity of all creation. It could be in a forest or by the shore of the sea. It could be during the concluding service on Yom Kippur or at the birth of a child. The question is, how do we bring the awareness of that higher unity into the everyday reality of this world? That is the challenge of sacred living, to realize more unity with patience and devotion, to make this world resemble the one on high. And this is where Judaism parts company with the religions of the East. Judaism understands this yearning as a sacred obligation, a requirement for holy living, a commandment. This is the problem that the Baal HaTanya teaches is solved with the second line of the Shema, the Baruch Shem Kavod, blessed is God's holy name, which is not in the biblical text itself, but was added by the rabbis as a congregational response. The Baruch Shem, he says, is our attempt to bring ultimate unity when we utter Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And when we recite the Baruch Shem Kavod, Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, blessed is the one, the glory of whose kingdom is renowned for all time, we try to bring that unity into everyday reality. It goes on for a little bit further. One of the things you learn about this, the last thing that we talked about Kushner was involved in telling stories. He ain't just a storyteller. He's a very bright man. But so one can take these prayers and parse them into pieces from different points of view, and each one can enrich us. The other nice thing about this, say you have a study group, and you have 8 people around a table, and there are 8 different people. One of these commentators is going to probably resonate with every person around the table. Everyone can be engaged. That's very nice. But what if we don't want to study Jewish literature? You could write your own